Okay, so welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today, we're diving into something, well, huge. I mean, it's one of history's biggest mysteries. The fall of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, it's a classic, isn't it? It's like you had this superpower dominating for centuries, unstoppable, it seemed. And then, poof, gone.
Right. Becomes a distant memory. And you gotta wonder, like, how did that happen? What actually brought down a civilization that powerful? Was it like those barbarian hordes everyone talks about? Or did it just sort of rot from the inside?
Yeah, that's exactly what we're going to get into today. And as you said, it's definitely not a simple answer. It wasn't just one thing. Rome's decline and fall, it was a really long process, unfolded over centuries.
So where do we even begin unpacking all of that?
Well, in this deep dive, we're going to try to pin down the key things that led to this monumental shift. And we'll use this awesome infographics show episode as our guide.
Sounds good. So I guess first things first, we got to go back to the beginning. Rome wasn't always an empire, right?
Exactly. It started as a republic.
So what happened? What were the big things that pushed it from republic to empire?
So it's interesting because even though the republic came about after they overthrew a king, it still ended up with, like, weaknesses. Over time, people started feeling like that republican system,
Yeah.
with its powerful Senate and all of that, was getting kind of clunky and prone to gridlock.
Right, like things just weren't working efficiently.
Exactly. And that created an opportunity. It opened the door for figures like Julius Caesar. They promised they could bring stability if they had more centralized power. And you also got to remember, even though the Republic got rid of the monarchy, it still had issues, like the Senate holding way too much power and these super influential generals with their own loyal armies.
Yeah.
All that just made things unstable and created the perfect conditions for someone like Caesar to rise up.
Yeah, and Caesar, he definitely took advantage of that, didn't he? He ended up as perpetual dictator, which is pretty much saying, I'm in charge forever. But it sounds like this move really freaked out the old Roman elite.
Oh, for sure. I mean, they saw Caesar consolidating all this power and showing zero interest in letting go. Of course they were going to be worried.
And they valued that republic even with all its problems.
Yep. And that fear, it led straight to his assassination. They were desperate to save the Republic, even if it meant taking such drastic measures.
But as often happens in history, things don't go as planned. That assassination didn't bring back the Republic. Instead, it just set off chaos, right? Like a ton of civil wars.
Oh, absolutely. Caesar's death created this power vacuum, and everyone who wanted power just jumped in to try and grab it. It was a brutal time. But in the end, it was Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, who came out on top.
He was pretty clever, right? Capitalizing on his dad's legacy and expanding Roman power even further.
Definitely. And one of the biggest things he did was conquer Egypt. That actually marked the end of the Hellenistic era. That time when Greek culture was super influential all over the Mediterranean. So that was a massive turning point in history.
So it's like super ironic. Those guys who killed Caesar to stop a monarchy, they basically paved the way for even stronger, more permanent rule.
Yep. The Senate pretty much gave Octavian the title of Augustus and said, okay, you're in charge forever. That's the official start of the Roman Empire.
Wow, so 27 BCE, that's a big date. And from there, I guess, the empire just kept growing, right?
Oh, yeah. They went on a huge expansion spree, adding all this territory in Europe, North Africa, and Asia Minor. It was massive.
And they organized all that new land into provinces, right? Each
Right.
one with a governor running things locally.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is that these provinces, they actually had a good amount of freedom as long as they paid their taxes and kept things peaceful. It's kind of like you do you, just keep the money flowing and don't cause any trouble.
I guess that made sense for running such a huge and diverse empire.
It did. For a while, at least, it led to what we call the Pax Romana, which was a period of, amazing stability and peace throughout the empire.
Sounds idyllic. But even during good times, problems can brew under the surface, right? I mean, our source mentions those internal pressures building up.
Yeah, and one big area was religion. You had the old Roman polytheistic beliefs, worshiping lots of gods like Jupiter.
Yeah.
Those stories were pretty wild, by the way, similar to the Greek myths.
Oh, yeah, full of drama.
Exactly. And then you have this new religion emerging, Christianity, with a totally different way of looking at things.
It must have been a culture clash.
Huge.
Yeah.
The Romans were used to their pantheon of gods, steeped in ancient traditions. And then comes this monotheistic faith from Judaism centered around Jesus and his teachings. For the Romans, particularly because Christians only believed in one God,
Right.
it was threatening. They saw it as a challenge to the traditional order and the whole imperial cult thing where they worship the emperors.
Right, that was like their whole thing.
Yeah.
So the Romans, they weren't exactly thrilled about this new religion.
Not at first. But as we all know, you can't really suppress something people really believe in. And that tension, it added another layer of complexity to the empire's inner workings.
So it wasn't just external threats they had to deal with. And speaking of internal problems, leadership plays a huge role, right? Like Emperor Commodus, he's a good example. He was young, obsessed with being a gladiator, and made some terrible decisions. Sounds kind of like a movie villain.
Oh, for sure. You're thinking of Gladiator.
Right. Exactly. But Commodus was real.
Oh, yeah, he was real, right. And his reign shows that even the most powerful empires can be messed up by bad leadership. His whole thing with the gladiatorial games and that crazy cult of personality, it destabilized Rome.
Yeah, it wasn't just bad luck. It was like a flaw in the system. And when he was assassinated, things just got worse.
Way worse. That whole year of the five emperors was a complete disaster. Emperors getting killed left and right, the Praetorian Guard basically auctioning off the title to whoever paid the most. Rome was falling apart.
So all this internal chaos, what did that do to the rest of the empire?
Imagine this. The provinces, who'd always had a degree of autonomy, suddenly see Rome in shambles. The central power is weak. What do? Some of them said, forget this, and declared independence.
So it's like the whole empire started splitting at the seams.
Exactly. And that's when you get breakaways like the Gallic Empire in the west and Queen Zenobia's Palmyrene Empire in the east.
Yeah.
These were big chunks of territory just gone. And all that infighting, it messed up the military too. They were spending resources on themselves instead of defending the borders, which left them vulnerable. It was a crisis, maybe the worst one Rome had faced until then.
It sounds like it. But the source mentions some emperors who managed to sort of put things back together, at least for a bit, like Aurelian and Diocletian, right?
Yeah, they were key figures. Aurelian was a strong military guy. He focused on reclaiming those breakaway empires. He also fortified Rome itself and even made the tough call to abandon some provinces that were too much trouble. And he also worked on the economy. Then you have Diocletian, who was all about long-term stability. He set up these regional centers to control the provinces better. And get this, he actually stepped down voluntarily, which was pretty unheard of for a Roman emperor.
And then you have Constantine the Great. It feels like his reign was a turning point for the empire in so many ways. He introduced a new currency, expanded the empire even more, reorganized the military, and, oh yeah, converted to Christianity.
You're right. Constantine was definitely a game changer. His reforms, they helped strengthen the empire. But his conversion to Christianity, that was massive. I mean, he had this vision right before a big battle, and that's what led him to convert. And that decision, it changed the whole religious landscape of the empire. It paved the way for the church to become super powerful. And by the end of his reign, the empire had gotten back most of the territory it had lost. And of course, he made Byzantium the new capital and renamed it Constantinople.
So things were looking up, at least from the outside. But the source says there were still problems lurking beneath the surface. What were some of those?
Well, you have to remember, the church's power was growing, which caused a lot of resentment from people who still followed the old Roman beliefs. And corruption was still a problem in the military. Plus, just the sheer size of the empire made it really tough to govern effectively. Communication was slow back then, and managing such a vast and diverse territory, it was just a huge challenge.
So after Constantine died, all those problems just exploded, right? More internal fighting, arguments over who should be emperor, and finally splitting the empire in two permanently after Theodosius I.
Exactly. Now, Theodosius, he was a good general. He managed to reunite the empire for a while. But when he died in 395 CE, the army wasn't as strong, and there was no clear heir. And that decision to divide the empire between his two sons, that was a game changer. The eastern part, which became the Byzantine Empire, they lasted for another 1,000 years. But the west, they were in serious trouble.
It's kind of like a company that's failing, right? They split in two, hoping maybe one part will survive. But I wonder, at the time, did people see it as a last-ditch effort, or did they think splitting up would actually make both halves stronger?
That's a great question, and it shows just how complex the situation was. It's fascinating to think about what people back then really thought about it all. But yeah, the West was definitely vulnerable, especially with all those external threats building up. Then you have the Huns.
Yeah, these nomadic warriors migrating from Asia, pushing other groups like the Goths towards Rome's borders.
The Huns were like a force of nature,
Mm-hmm.
and their westward push had this domino effect. As they moved into Europe, the Gothic tribes started looking for safety, and a lot of them ended up at Rome's doorstep, essentially asking for refuge.
But it sounds like Rome kind of fumbled the ball on that one.
Big time.
Ah.
They completely mishandled the situation. You had these corrupt Roman officials exploiting the Goths, making them pay huge fees to enter, and then not even providing them with the resources they needed or trying to integrate them properly. Instead of seeing this as a chance to maybe bolster their army with these new people, they basically created an enemy within their own borders. It wasn't just a tactical error, it was a huge strategic blunder. It shows how even superpowers can mess up by mismanaging things like this and creating internal enemies.
So this wave of refugees turned into a guerrilla war within the empire.
Sadly, yeah. And even though the Roman military still looked powerful on paper, it was spread thin. They focused on the cities, leaving the countryside and the frontiers open to attack. And meanwhile, the rich folks in their villas and palaces, they were shielded from all this chaos at first. It really highlights the disconnect between the people in charge and what was happening on the ground.
Classic tale of the elites being out of touch.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The Roman military, they had the training and weapons, but they weren't the unstoppable force they used to be. Years of internal fighting and focusing on keeping order within the empire has weakened them. Theodosius, he tried to fix the military, but they were broke. He had to raise taxes, which just made people even angrier and led to more rebellions. And his religious policies alienated a lot of the non-Christian population. So, yeah, they were in a tough spot.
And then you have the death of Theodosius in 395 and the formal division of the empire that really sealed the fate of the Western Roman Empire, didn't it?
It was a major blow, for sure. The East, as we said, they went on to become the Byzantine Empire and lasted another 1,000 years. But the West was losing territory it would never get back.
They were basically on life support at that point.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
And they kept getting hit from all sides.
Mm.
The Huns, led by Attila, they became a direct threat. And then you had all those Goths who were never really integrated, causing constant problems. The Western Roman military was getting weaker, and their territory kept shrinking. It was a slow, painful decline.
Death by 1,000 cuts, as they say.
Exactly. And then, in 476 CE, it all came to a head.
The final blow.
Yeah. Odoacer, a barbarian general, he invades Italy and overthrows the last Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus. The poor guy was just a teenager. But surprisingly, Odoacer didn't mistreat him.
Huh, that's interesting. You'd expect a conquering general to be a little harsher.
Right. But he kind of just let Romulus live out his days peacefully. Anyway, Odoacer declared himself king of Italy, but the Roman Senate wouldn't recognize him. They still considered the Eastern Empire in Constantinople as the legitimate Roman authority.
So that's pretty much the end of the story for the Western Roman Empire as a functioning political entity.
Yeah, that's the date most historians agree on. While Odoacer controlled Italy, he was never really accepted by the Romans. And that's how the Western Empire faded away, its territories breaking apart into various kingdoms.
But here's the thing that I find fascinating. Even though the empire was gone in the West, its influence lived on, especially through the Roman Catholic Church. They became a major power in Europe for centuries.
That's so true. The church, they stepped into the void left by the empire and became this unifying force in Europe. They shaped not just religion, but also politics and culture for a long time. I mean, even centuries later, you have someone like Henry VIII challenging the Pope's authority, showing how powerful the church had become.
It's like the empire left behind this huge legacy, even after it was gone.
Absolutely. And when we look at the reasons for Rome's fall, it's clear there wasn't one single cause. It was a bunch of things all coming together. But the decline of the military was definitely a major factor. They had trouble recruiting, had to rely on mercenaries who weren't always reliable, and they spent a ton of money without really making the army stronger. It's like they were investing in the wrong things.
And that's never a good sign.
Nope. Plus, governing such a massive empire was just incredibly difficult. Like we said before, communication was super slow back then, so keeping everything running smoothly over such a vast distance was a nightmare.
And then you add in all those internal problems, bad leaders, political instability with all those assassinations and coups, and a system where people in power just used the empire's resources for their own gain. It's like they were rotting from the inside out.
Exactly. It was a system that was breaking down.
Yeah.
Without strong and competent leadership, Rome couldn't handle all the challenges it was facing.
And what about that fatal mistake the source mentions, the whole thing with the Goths?
Oh yeah, that was huge. They couldn't decide whether to fight them off completely or try to integrate them. They ended up doing neither effectively, which led to all these long, drawn-out conflicts that drained Rome's strength. A missed opportunity with devastating consequences.
So the fall of the Roman Empire, it wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a long, slow burn over centuries. And it's a story full of, well,
Yeah,
Lessons.
it really is. A cautionary tale about what can happen when things start going wrong on multiple levels.
Mm.
You've got internal weaknesses like bad leaders, economic troubles, and social divisions, all made worse by external pressures like migrations and invasions. It's an epic story of rise and fall, and it makes you think, doesn't it?
For sure.
So here's something to ponder. Think about the challenges Rome faced. Trying to manage a huge and diverse territory, balancing military power with economic stability, and figuring out how to integrate different people. Do those sound familiar at all?
Oh, absolutely. They're super relevant today.
Right. And it's worth considering how the Roman Empire's legacy still affects us today. We're talking about more than just the ruins and the history books.
Yeah.
Their impact goes way deeper than that.
Yeah, there's so much we can learn from Rome, both its successes and its failure.
Exactly. And that's why it's so fascinating to keep digging into its story.
I totally agree. And hey, to all our listeners, if you're interested in learning more, definitely check out the infographics show episode we used for this deep dive. It's a great starting point.
Definitely. It's a visually engaging and informative video, perfect for diving deeper into this complex period of history.
All right, everyone, thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time.
See you then.